Hamlet. About Hamlet, written a lot of research and comments in different languages. The number of bibliographical names, articles and books pertaining to Hamlet is probably measured by a figure close to 20,000. This is not accidental. Belinsky rightly called Hamlet the most brilliant diamond in the effulgent crown of the king of dramatic poets. V.G. Belinsky, Hamlet, the drama of Shakespeare. Mokolov's role of Hamlet 1838 in the book. V.G. Belinsky complete works under the editorship of S. A. Vengerov, T3, S.A.B., 1901-187-188. Amlothi, an ancient form of the name Hamlet, is found in ancient Scandinavian legends. Researchers have decomposed this word into its constituent parts, Onemela and Odi, which means frantic, insane. Apparently, Hamlet's feigned madness was originally included in this story. It is possible that the epithet, frantic, insane, also hints at that latent passion, which from the very beginning was marked by the image of Hamlet. So in Shakespeare's tragedy, when Laertes grabs Hamlet by the throat, the scene of Ophelia's funeral, he says about himself, "Though I am not hot-tempered and not rash, but there's danger in me." Passion escapes with all its might when Hamlet, having unclasped Claudia's clenched teeth, pours poisoned wine into his mouth. The murderer, the damned king of Denmark, drink. And then he adds ironically, "Where's your pearl?" In the goblet was not a pearl, because the king together threw a poison into the cup. The story of Hamlet was first recorded at the end of the 12th century by the Danish chronograph Saxo Grammatic. In ancient times of paganism, this is the story written in Latin. The ruler of Jutland was killed during the feast by his brother Feng, who then married his widow. The son of the murdered, young Hamlet, as Saxo Grammatic calls it, decided to avenge the murder of his father. To gain time and seem safe in the eyes of the insidious Feng, Hamlet pretended to be insane. All his actions were talking about perfect mental numbness, but his speeches were littered with bottomless cunning, and no one could understand the hidden meaning of his words. So in Shakespeare's Hamlet the words are full of hidden meanings. This pretended mental stupor was partly inspired by Hamlet's personal qualities, for, according to Saxo Grammatic, it was a man whose vigorous activity alternated with a decline in strength. On completion of the case, he fell into inactivity, writes Saxo Grammatic. Feng's friend, a more self-assured person than intelligent future Polonius, undertook to check whether Hamlet was insane. To overhear Hamlet's conversation with his mother, he hid under the straw bed. But Hamlet was cautious. Entering the mother, he first searched the room and found the hiding spy. He killed him, cut the corpse into pieces and, having cooked these pieces in boiling water, threw them to be eaten by pigs. Then he returned to his mother, laced her heart with reproaches and left her crying in mourning. Feng sent Hamlet to England, accompanied by 2 courtiers, the future Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, secretly handing them a letter to the English king asking him to kill Hamlet. Like Hamlet, Hamlet substituted a letter, and the English king sent 2 of his courtiers to be executed instead. The English king graciously accepted Hamlet, talked with him a lot and marveled at his wisdom. Hamlet married a daughter of the English king. Then he returned to Jutland, where during the feast he drank Feng and his court drunks and lit the palace. The courtiers died in the fire. Fengu Hamlet himself chopped off his own head. So Hamlet triumphed, which, according to Saxo grammar, surpassed Hercules with his exploits. In 1576, the French writer Belforte reproduced this ancient legend in his tragic stories. For Belforte, as for the Saxon grammar, the plot was based on the implementation of blood feud. After killing his enemy, Hamlet exclaims, "Tell your brother whom you killed so cruelly that you died a violent death, let his shadow calm down with this news among the blessed spirits and free me from the duty that forced me to take revenge for my own blood." The Russian translation of the story of Belforte about Hamlet is in the book V. Shakespeare, Tragedy of Hamlet, Prince of Denmark, translated by K.R., Volume 2, St. Petersburg, 1900, pages 228. In the 80s of the 16th century, a play about Hamlet was staged on the London stage, in which, that's all we know about it, a ghost of the murdered father appeared. In 1596, Thomas Lodge wrote about the pale face of a ghost who screams from the stage plaintively, like an oyster dealer. Hamlet, Revenge. The author of this play was apparently Thomas Kyd, whose work is familiar to us from the only surviving his play, Spanish Tragedy, 1586, about which we spoke. Knowing the lost for us play Kyd, as well as not only the French story Belforte, but, as studies show, and the old Latin edition of the Saxon grammar, Shakespeare created his Hamlet. According to Ophelia, Hamlet was once the mirror of fashion, owned the sword of the warrior and the language of the scientist, possessed the appearance of the courtier. And this brilliant young man entered the university. In the English universities of that time, Shakespeare here, as elsewhere, described under foreign names and clothes surrounding English reality, there was a whole abyss separating the noble rich from poor students. A contemporary reads, "People of the nobility and rich send their sons to the university, as in the best school of fencing and dancing." Meanwhile, the law forbade poor students of Oxford and Cambridge to ask for alms on the street. Hamlet stepped over this abyss and became friends with the poor student Horatio. Hamlet is in front of us in an ink mourning cloak. His simple clothes are deprived, as can be seen from the text, of the sable edge. On his shoes there are no outlets, which were then worn by dandies, as well as actors who played the role of heroes and lovers. Like clothes, his speech is simple. It is characteristic that, unlike not only the king, but also from the Norwegian Prince Fortinbras, he always speaks of himself, I, not we. But in his speeches there is that grace of simplicity, which is so inimitable, able to transmit the Swan of Avon, as Shakespeare called Ben Jonson. We see Hamlet for the first time already in internal struggle with the world around him. It is especially characteristic of him that behind the particular phenomena he instantly sees their common cause. The act of the mother, who so quickly forgot her former love. She did not wear shoes yet. For Hamlet, a typical expression of the injustice of the world around him. Hamlet, with his whole being, feels an aversion to this world where a smiling scoundrel wields, a smiling scoundrel, as Hamlet of King Claudius calls, and where Rosencrantz and Guildensterns are teeming. According to Goethe's subtle remark, these two perfectly similar people would be representatives of a whole lot of similar to them, insidious, mean and at the same time impersonal people. In a world in a garden overgrown with weeds, Hamlet does not want to live. The world, a prison, says Hamlet. It is interesting that this image of peace is a prison is also found in the author of Utopia by Thomas More. At the heart of the ancient story was the motive for blood feud. Shakespeare took this motive from Hamlet and transferred it to Laertes. Blood vengeance did not require feelings. The murderer of his father needs revenge even if a poisoned blade, according to his feudal morals, Laertes reasoned. The ghost appeals to the other in a different way, referring to Hamlet. If you loved your father, avenge his murder. This is revenge for a loved one. Hamlet instantly, on fast wings, would rush to the implementation of revenge, if, recall, the particular phenomena did not open up before his mind as typical. The father was for him not only a father or a royal Dane, but above all a man. I once saw your father, says Horatio. He was a handsome king. He was a man, Hamlet corrects his friend. The news of the murder of his father for Hamlet, the news of the death of a man. Hamlet is shocked by this news. The task of personal revenge grows for him in the task of improving society. It is not for nothing that Hamlet sums up all the thoughts, impressions, feelings brought out of the meeting with the ghost of his father in words that the century is dislocated and that the task to correct this dislocation fell on him. The central place of the tragedy is the famous monologue, "To be or not to be." He was always very popular. In the middle of the X7th century he was even transferred to music and sang as a romance with the guitar. At the beginning of the monologue, Hamlet asks himself, what is nobler, is it silently to demolish sling and arrows of violent fate, or to raise arms against the sea of disasters? Silently, to contemplate without a murmur. Hamlet cannot, but to raise arms against the sea of disasters is useless. It means to perish, and Hamlet immediately turns to the thought of death, to die, to fall asleep. After careful study of the text, the image of a man standing with a drawn sword in his hand before a multitude of raging and ready to absorb his waves is especially vividly remembered. Hamlet sees the injustice of the oppressor, the scorn of the proud man, the pain of rejected love, delays in the courts, strikes that take patient dignity from the unworthy. See the monologue, "To be or not to be." Act 3, Picture 1. Again we recall the quoted on page 171 of Shakespeare's 66th sonnet. Life seems to him a heavy burden. He is aware of the unsettled world, but does not know the ways to correct evil. Historically, it could not be otherwise. Hamlet, as if a synthetic portrait of the humanists of the Shakespeare era. Shakespeare himself belonged to them. That's why we have the right to say that in the image of Hamlet Shakespeare invested part of his own soul. As was noticed by someone, only Hamlet could write these plays from all the characters in Shakespeare's plays. The humanists of that epoch saw the untruth surrounding them, became envious of it, but they could not correct the evil, because they did not know and could not know the real ways for this. They, like Hamlet, were dreamers. Recall that it was at that time that social utopias were created, drawing an ideal society based on justice. But the humanists of the Shakespearean era did not and could not find a bridge between utopia and life. Their dream remained a lonely island, separated from reality yet not accessible for navigation by the ocean. And this split between dream and reality generated in their souls a deep, Hamlet sorrow. Freed from the medieval worldview, according to which man was only an obedient tool of the deity, they understood the greatness of man. What an amazing creature a man is, says Hamlet, how noble with reason, how infinite in ability, how expressive he is and marvelous in appearance and movement, in his actions he is equal to the angel, in thought to God. The beauty of the world. This ideal portrait has little in common with the criminal Claudius, the cunning, the small Polonius, the rapacious, repulsive Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, the insidious Osric, the gloomy creatures dominating the world in which Hamlet lives. Man does not please me, Hamlet adds the final touch to the ideal portrait of a man he painted. The discrepancy between the dream and reality gave rise to the consciousness of their powerlessness and the feeling of deep sorrow, that black melancholy that was as typical of the English Renaissance as the Falstaff's laughter. Consciousness of their powerlessness, sorrow, the thought of suicide pursue Hamlet on the hills. The resentment of humanists for public evil often took in the English drama of that time a gloomy face of the so-called tragedies of revenge. Shakespeare's Hamlet also belongs to the tragedies of revenge. It is remarkable that the plot itself caused condemnation from reactionary-minded writers. The playwright Turner, 1575, 1626, in his play, The Tragedy of an Atheist or The Revenge of an Honest Man, polemized with Shakespeare. According to Turner, the son has no right to avenge his father, let him grant revenge to the King of Kings, that is, to God, for, as Turner said, revenge of an honest man is in long suffering. V.Y. Katchelov in the role of Hamlet. The Moscow Art Theatre, 1911. Before Hamlet, as we have seen, there are two goals. 1. personal, to avenge the death of his father; the other, the general, correction of the world around him. Hamlet's personal goal is successful. He kills all his enemies. But the second remains unresolved, and this weighs on Hamlet, tells him the features of a duality and painful reflection. In a monologue in the fourth picture of Act IV, Hamlet says that for the action he has cause, will, power and means. And yet he hesitates. He hesitates because the private task is another, a common task, to the solution of which he does not see the ways. Even after the murder of Claudius, Hamlet speaks of an unsettled world. The murder of Claudius did not solve anything. In this society there will still be thousands of other Claudians, Polyneve, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. And yet Hamlet does not die a pessimist. Before his death he asks Horace to tell people his story. Even at this moment he is full of hope for the future. So Hamlet speaks of his will and power. But in another place he speaks of his weakness. In one place he opposes himself to Hercules, in the other he compares himself with Hercules. He scolds himself for inaction, and in the monologue, To Be or Not to Be, speaks of the natural color of determination, that is, he himself indicates that he is by nature a resolute person. Oil is dreamy and at the same time differs with sharp observation. For example, he immediately guessed that Rosencrantz and Guildenstern were sent to him by the king. He also immediately realized that the king for good reason sends him to England. What is the matter? Weakness of the will and the consciousness of duty is the idea of this giant creation of Shakespeare. Gerda Belinsky formulated the point of view in his article Hamlet, Shakespeare's Drama, Mocha Love as Hamlet. Belinsky immediately noted with heartfeltness that this weakness is not at all the main idea, but only the manifestation of the other. What is this other idea? In other words, what is the reason for Hamlet's inaction? It must be sought in the era that gave birth to the image of Hamlet, in the historically inevitable and so typical for the time discrepancy of that humanistic dream and evil, grim reality. The tragedy of Hamlet is the tragedy of the humanism of the Shakespearean era. Hamlet could not solve the question. Its greatness lies in the fact that the question was posed to them. And for centuries Shakespeare's ingenious tragedy awakened thought, called for the realization of light humanistic ideals. The Middle Ages had little interest in the inner world of man, the variety of his living and sometimes conflicting feelings. The era of the Renaissance put man in the spotlight, and just as seafarers of that era discovered new oceans and new lands, writers opened new depths in the inner world of man. The depth of his soul, the vividness of his experiences, the image of Hamlet enticed actors and viewers for centuries. Next to Hamlet arise, also as living, criminal Claudius, secretly tormented by repentance, in love with him, unhappy queen, as Hamlet calls her, very young Ophelia, who involuntarily becomes an instrument in the hands of the enemies of her beloved, self-confident, cunning, limited Polonius and his son Laertes, brought up on the canons of knightly honor, and at the same time giving hope to the elder to become the second Polonius. He already likes, like his father, to read long moralizing sermons, a whole gallery of living portraits created by a great artist. Realist. Let us recall the scene of the prayer of Claudius, Act 3, Picture 3. In addition, when Polonius talks about pretense, Act 3, Picture 1, Claudius speaks of how his conscience suffers from the words of Polonius. "Oh, heavy wax!" exclaims Claudius. How did Hamlet play in the days of Shakespeare? In the elegy written for the death of Richard Burbage in 1619, the following is said. When Burbage, playing in some role, jumped to the grave, he performed it with such a truthful expression that it seemed he himself is ready to die. Elegy also tells us that Burbage was playing on the stage of a dying man, blood-stained by the blood, and that not only spectators, but also actors, at that moment, seemed to be dying really. Here, perhaps, we are talking about Hamlet, the scene in the cemetery, and the finale. The famous tragedian, of course, had moments of strong, true performance. But, on the other hand, Anthony Scollay in the verse poem, The Defent, or Love Passion, printed in 1604, tells how Hamlet tears passion to shreds. From the words of the Scollay, one can also conclude that Burbage accentuated Hamlet's feigned madness. The score tells how Hamlet tears off his jacket and stays in the same shirt. It was a performance in which the outward effects were primarily emphasized. Image of the play, Hamlet at the Globe Theatre. How did Burbage interpret the image of Hamlet? This question is of exceptional interest because Burbage, no doubt, consulted with Shakespeare. We here have indirect evidence. The successor to Burbage in the role of Hamlet was actor Taylor. The last in the role of Hamlet saw William Davenant, who led the work on the role of Hamlet, the famous actor Thomas Betterton, 1635–1710, who sought to revive the ancient traditions of the Globe. According to the writer Richard Steele, who saw Betterton as Hamlet in 1709 Reptiles, remarkably that Betterton was then 70 years old, Betterton created the image of a promising, lively and enterprising young man. He played Hamlet in the clothes of a schoolboy. The tragic tale of Hamlet, the Prince of Denmark on the Globe scene, liked everyone, as shown by Scollay. There was something in this play that reached the audience, especially from the common people. In the preface to his Defent, Scollay asks himself whether to write to him as the court poet and writer Philip Sidney wrote, or to touch the heart of the common folk element, like the tragedies of a friendly Shakespeare. Scollay immediately mentions Hamlet. In September 1607, the British ship Dragon sailed across the Atlantic Ocean, heading for the East Indies. Were hot, windless days. The team was exhausted from idleness. The captain of the ship, William Keeling, wishing, according to his own words, to distract people from idleness, gambling and unaware sleep, allowed the team to play performances. On September 5, Captain Keeling recorded in the ship's journal, "We performed the tragedy Hamlet." On September 13, he wrote, "Played King Richard II." On March 31, 1608, Keeling wrote in the magazine, "I invited Captain Hawkins to dinner, ate fish. Hamlet was on board our ship." Actor Richard Burbage. On the title page of the first edition of Hamlet, 1603, we read, "It is printed in the form in which this tragedy was performed, at the universities of Cambridge and Oxford, as well as in other places." Meanwhile, it is known that professional actors were forbidden to perform in the walls of universities. Hence, in all probability, it follows that the students played Hamlet in amateur theatricals. Since the tragedy had not yet been printed, the students somehow had to receive the manuscript of Hamlet. This leads us to assume that among Shakespeare's acquaintances there were university students. Such an acquaintance could also begin in London. Let us also remind the reader that Shakespeare on the road to Stratford passed through Oxford. From Oxford students, the manuscript could easily have reached the students of Cambridge. The closeness of Shakespeare to student circles speaks, perhaps, the following. From some places of Shakespeare's works, it appears that he was in general familiar with the law of circulation. Meanwhile, William Harvey, 1578–1657, who opened this law, published the results of his discovery only in 1628, which confounded the commentators. However, Harvey began to lecture at Oxford University in 1600 and in these lectures already outlined the essence of the subsequently developed law. Shakespeare could learn about the discovery from one of the students. And, finally, it is interesting that in 1601 students of Cambridge University created a review, Return from Parnassus, in which the name of Shakespeare is very warmly mentioned. Shakespeare's biographers ignore for some reason or other the totality of these facts, evidently evidencing some connection that existed between Shakespeare and university students. In any case, The fact that the universities are mentioned on the title page of the first edition of Hamlet is significant. The tragic tale of Hamlet, Prince of Denmark, could not but be close to the student circles of that era. It is no accident that in the very tragedy of another Hamlet, a humanist thinker dressed in the clothes of a Danish prince is the poor student of Horatio.